Welcome to the Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. The emergence of COVID-19 has had far-reaching and wide-ranging impacts on the Canadian economy. 17 months into the pandemic, Equifax has a depth of data on the unique ways that Canadians, from individual households to entire industries, have been affected by and are responding to these uncertain circumstances. I talk with Becky Oates, Assistant Vice President of Advanced Analytics at Equifax Canada, to unpack the latest research on the matter. We talk about the Canadian K-shaped recovery, stimulus strategies, and economic forecasting in unprecedented times.
Sure. I mean, one of the biggest shifts I guess we've seen really is reduced activity. And if you think about how many businesses operate, they often have supply relationships. They might be using financial credit as well, just in their day-to-day activities. If you say you're a restaurant, you need to buy your goods from somewhere to kind of make your meals from, or there's kind of that ongoing credit relationship. And what we've seen is just far less demand for new supply relationships, for new financial lending.
Let's listen in now. Becky, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me. I was looking at your background, and I actually spent some time not so far from where you went to university. I was in Newcastle upon Tyne up in northern England. I think you may know of it, or you may be from that region. Is that am I in the ballpark there?
So I'm originally from Yorkshire, actually, which is a bit further south of Newcastle. But yeah, I did my undergraduate degree from Newcastle, so I know it well.
Yeah, fantastic. I traveled all over. I went to a wedding there and then traveled all over England and up to Scotland. And so it was just such a wonderful place. A little hard on the rent-a-car, though, that wrong side of the road driving. That was a little hard for me on the wrong side of the road. All right, well, listen, let's jump in. Well, I've kind of already jumped in, but let's talk a little bit, first of all, about you, what you do, who you are, how you came to do what you do, and exactly what you do at Equifax.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm originally from England, which you can probably hear from my accent. So my family and I moved over to Canada kind of middle of 2017. And that was actually for the role here at Equifax. So my background, I've always been in data and analytics, primarily in the credit and finance industry, although I've worked with kind of government agencies and telcos and utility companies as well. I guess background wise, as a child, I always loved numbers and puzzles. So I've always been a bit of a maths geek. That's the best way of describing it. So my role within Equifax is that I head up our analytics and data science team. That kind of sounds like quite a fancy title, but what it really means is we take data and we turn that into insights and solutions to help both consumers and businesses kind of with their decisioning. And that's really what we do day to day.
And when you came over from, was that a similar? What brought you to Canada? Was that just a natural career progression, or did you always want to go to a cold climate? What is it that attracted you to the Canadian opportunity?
Do you know what? The summers here are really hot. So we always wanted to kind of work abroad. So classic in England, people tend to look at Canada and Australia. Australia has far too many spiders for my liking. So Canada, we came over in 2016 and just fell in love with the country. So that's really what kind of brought us here.
Well, let's talk about Equifax. I mean, certainly a familiar name to the listeners, to the retailers listening. But, like many things, you may know the name, but not know the full scope and scale and everything. So unpack for a few minutes all about Equifax and what it does and the global footprint and all those great things.
Sure. So here in Canada, I guess people will know us as being one of the two credit bureaus. So that's kind of what most people think of when they think of Equifax. They think of credit scores in particular, but actually our reach is kind of far greater than that. So we are a global data analytics and technology company. And we really play an essential role in the global economy by helping financial institutions, companies, employers, government agencies to make kind of those critical decisions with greater confidence. So we're headquartered in Atlanta in the US, but globally we have kind of 11,000 employees. We're in 24 countries. It's quite a big organization.
Yeah, I had no idea. So this is why I love answering that question, because I think of Equifax, I knew of it in one dimension, but I had no idea it was so big and so global and all that stuff. I did know it was based in Atlanta, because I know your chief security officer, he came from Home Depot. Jamil came from Home Depot, so it's a bit of a connection there. He spoke at a loss prevention conference up here in Toronto a couple of years ago. All right, so you've just put this study out, and there's a lot to unpack here. So let's get started. I mean, first of all, I mean, you described the K economy. I'm familiar with what the K-shaped recovery looks like, but maybe not all listeners are. So why don't you talk about what a K recovery from an economics perspective looks at, and then we'll start peeling back the onion, so to speak, and get into the survey.
Sure. So put really simply, a K-shaped recovery is something that can occur after a recession or some large event in an economy. And it basically just means that there are parts of it which recover quicker or slower than others. So in some areas, you may find they could recover very quickly and see growth very quickly, and things kind of get back to normal or even a faster growth than before. And for others, it can take a lot longer. Perhaps you see some decline initially, or it's flat for a while before that recovery really starts to come through. And that's where the name comes from. If you think about the shape of the letter K, it's kind of that splitting of recovery. And that's kind of what it means.
Oh, interesting. I've also talked about it in the context of almost a bifurcation in who recovers, because the perhaps a unique element of the COVID crisis is it's really divided, for household income levels, 70,000 and above, to pick a kind of generally random and not specifically random number. They're doing better because they're not in the service sector, and the service sector is really, really being punished. I mean, in retail, some retailers are doing fantastic, others not so much. But in the service sector, like restaurants and hotels, it's uniformly not great, right? I mean, that's also the characteristic you think of. When I think of the K recovery, do you concur, or do you think of it that way as well?
No, absolutely. I think what's really interesting since COVID obviously started last year and all of kind of the last 12-month period, even when we look at kind of the data that we see on the more on the credit side, you start to see that there are pockets where historically these consumers or these businesses have been really strong from a credit standpoint, and all of a sudden it's a complete shift. Right. Whereas on the other side, you're seeing some areas that actually historically were struggling, and actually, some of the support programs, and we can go into some more detail, they've actually really helped and actually done the opposite and made those people in a much better situation. So it's a really interesting period where things are moving in ways which perhaps we haven't seen historically.
Well, and it's so interesting because you bring in government subsidies, which of course here go to go into wage subsidies, and in America, right, they're getting $1,600 checks at their front door. It's a very interesting time, as you say. So let's focus on consumers and because you do talk about both consumers and businesses. Let's start talking about consumers. I mean, what's interesting to me as I've been watching things like the savings rate, which is a bit enforced, right? I can't travel, so my savings rate goes up. It looks to me like Canadians are kind of divided, but mostly writing down household debt, maybe writing down credit card debt, so leaving some open to buy, which is probably good news for retailers. Is that what you're seeing in behind the massive analytics?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this really started last year back in April time, that first big wave of lockdowns. That's when we really saw the biggest drop in spend on credit cards. We did see a drop in payments as well at that point. But obviously with all of those lockdowns, people weren't going out to restaurants. They weren't going out and kind of buying the things they did traditionally. They weren't going out and buying new cars. There was a period where demand for credit was really low. And if you combine that again with some of the support mechanisms that came in quite quickly. So some of the lenders were offering payment deferrals on things like their mortgages. You had some of the government supports like CERB and things like that came into play. As you mentioned, those savings started to increase. And what we saw was a flip in that actually consumers were paying off more than they were spending. And that had a real positive impact in terms of that unsecured household debt. That definitely started to come down, and it has been coming down for several months. I mean, from a retail standpoint, I guess the good news is we are seeing that credit card spend start to creep back up again. It's still below the levels it was at. But again, the payments are really coming through. So in January, for every $10 of credit card spend, $11 was paid off of credit card debt. So we're still seeing people overpaying compared to what they're spending. Which
lays a nice groundwork, I think, for future growth, because it creates, just as I said, open to buy on the credit card, right, as opposed to a maxed out or a big balance on the credit card. Are you seeing, and how did you see it? There. I talked to other providers more on the credit card payment side, who, from a security perspective, and they were seeing such unusual behavior that it threw all their algorithms off in terms of security, right? Suddenly people are buying, $500 online purchases where they'd never bought before. Any of that noise find its way into your data, or is that kind of just factored in from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the data that we see tends to be more the month-to-month behavior of how a consumer's paying down. So we're not looking at the individual basket level transactions necessarily that kind of are occurring. I mean, but again, we are seeing some different switches. So we're seeing more consumers that are paying off their credit card in full, which is a real positive. Less people are revolving a balance. So it all sounds good news on that front. But again, it's a K-curve recovery. And what we are seeing, although the vast majority, and we're seeing overall, it looks like a positive picture. When you start to peel that onion, as you called it, and you start to look at, are there some additional pockets where consumers are still really struggling? There are some. And again, they may not historically have been in financial difficulty. They have been leveraging some of these support mechanisms. But yet, as they're starting to end, things like deferral programs starting to end, we're seeing some consumers are unable to keep making those payment commitments.
Yeah, it's that characteristic of the K. Now let's talk about, let's switch the conversation a little bit over to small business and medium-sized business and what you're seeing on that side, because I read with great interest your perspectives on that. Share a little bit of that with us.
Sure. I mean, one of the biggest shifts, I guess, we've seen really is reduced activity. And if you think about how many businesses operate, they often have supply relationships. They might be using financial credit as well, just in their day-to-day activities. If say you're a restaurant, you need to buy your goods from somewhere to kind of make your meals from, or, there's kind of that ongoing credit relationship. And what we've seen is just far less demand for new supply relationships, for new financial lending. We're seeing less activity in terms of, the balance, the spend on some of those trades come through. Now, whereas on the consumer side, that's really positive. For business, that potentially is a negative thing, because it means that if they've got reduced activity, are they, managing to get the revenue still? Potentially not. So that's kind of the biggest shift that we've seen is that lack of demand for credit, reduced activity. We've also seen some of the areas where perhaps we've seen a higher percentage of businesses going bankrupt. So Quebec is one where we saw that actually there was since April last year, they've had one of the highest bankruptcy rates across the country. Right. And then we're also monitoring quite closely some of the areas that potentially have some additional risk going forward over the next 12 months. So, for example, Alberta is always one where we see quite a volatile economy. That's one that we're kind of monitoring quite closely.
Well, since you brought it up, are you seeing any regional differences or sectorial differences that you might comment on? You've already kind of commented on Quebec and Alberta. Anything else jump out at you? I
mean, retail's a big one. The service industry, hospitality, tourism, even construction. I mean, we've all seen kind of some of the lumber prices that they've been kind of battling on the construction side right now, and that's obviously having an impact on that industry. So, there are some that are continuing to be in difficulty, and retail's quite broad. Like, as you mentioned yourself, there are some retailers that are doing very well in this period, but there are a whole pile of others that are really struggling. And it's really important because these businesses feed jobs, and they employ a lot of people.
Sure do.
So it has an impact across the economy if those start to fail.
How do your colleagues on the other side of the building, so to speak, we're all working at home, but on the other side who do credit analysis, like typically for small business, the cycle of using credit, paying off credit, using credit builds up a credit rating. The past year, there's been a lot less of that. How do they see that? Do they take that into account as they, you would establish your credit rating through a service like Equifax, or, they would come to understand either your sector or your business specifically based on your expenses and you're paying back. Is that being factored into big models? And how do you look at that in terms of how to project to help them help us?
Yeah, and it's a real challenging one because, again, I think more so on the commercial side, some of those traditional risk scores, they still do a very good job. They're still very predictive. They rank order the right way. But as you mentioned, there are some behaviors where historically it's really, it could be seen more positively, like low balance debt, things like that, where actually that could be an indicator of the opposite now. So, what we've been trying to do is work more closely with some of those businesses to try help them understand their portfolio, understand who they're lending money to, or they have trade relationships with, and see, what kind of is a more holistic view other than just relying on kind of a credit risk score or something like that. I think that's kind of the way you need to think about it, is try and really understand the geographical differences, the sectorial differences right now. And that's kind of what our advice has been for many businesses.
So it's made everyone's job at your shop a little more complicated, but I guess for someone who grew up with an abacus, probably looking up from the crib, you're loving it because it's complicated and it's not by rote, right? I'm sure you've thrown out a few models and recreated a few others, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure I'm old enough for an abacus, but
well, it makes for a good toy for some. Let's talk about the future. So turning our minds to, coming out of the COVID era, which, thankfully we're moving apace, not quite as fast as your home country, but we're kind of moving apace in terms of coming out of it from a vaccine perspective. What's your forecast for the future? What do you see in the short, medium, and long term? Do you think there'll be a pent up demand, and this open to buy, as I've said a couple of times, will release the Kraken and suddenly the economy will flourish, or there's inflationary pressures? You've mentioned that too. How do you put this all together and think about what's to come for the rest of the year, and even with a lens into the next 12 months?
Yeah, and I would love to have a magic ball right now. Obviously, this is unprecedented. So we haven't been through a scenario like this historically. So it's not something I can go back and say, let's analyze some data that's going to tell us what's going to happen. Right. I mean, ultimately, this is going to come down to consumer activity and consumer confidence. And as you mentioned, the good news is that there is that open to buy available, and there's different methods for consumers to buy now. There's buy now, pay later coming into the market. There's a whole lot of different mechanisms at play. And credit card spend is on the rise. It's not as high as it was, but it is going in the right direction. The challenge is probably going to be about that consumer confidence piece. And this is where I'm really keeping a close eye on what's happening in other geographies. And you mentioned the UK there, where we saw, classic, I'm British, so I can say this. We all like to go out and have a drink. So when the bars and pubs reopened,
that was the big headline.
Yeah, everyone sat in the rain in the beer gardens. That's what we do.
Wonderful.
But interestingly, when you see a few weeks later, when they started reopening some of the restaurants, you were hearing reports of these restaurants being empty. And in some cases, they were really struggling, and a lot of that came down to consumer confidence. I was chatting to a colleague in Australia who said that their challenge right now is more the inner city business districts, where workers, the commuting population, aren't going back to the office yet, and they're still working from home, and that's completely changing some of the economics in terms of, all the support mechanisms, again, in those service areas for that population. So I think it's really about consumer confidence. I think the short term, there's still going to be those industries that are really going to struggle because I don't think the return's going to be as quick. I hope it is, but I don't think it will be as quick for some. I think longer term, when you look at, consumers have been amassing more savings. They have reduced their household debt. There is that potential for them to pick that spending up. I think the longer term outlook is a bit more positive, but I think there may still be some challenges ahead.
Well, it's interesting we talk about England and Australia. One thing they have in common is they went to a voucher-like system where they gave citizens $25 or whatever to go and enjoy a pint or go and enjoy a meal. Do you think that's a good stimulus approach? And in Canada, it's very different, right? In Canada, the approach is more wage support for the businesses. And I think the theory there is if you give $25 to people who don't need it, you're not really, it's not really, give it to the restaurants and let them survive. Do you have an opinion? I'm more in the opinion than an analyst here, but from an economic perspective, do you see pros and cons? Or let me ask the question differently. If you were sitting in Ottawa and thinking about a stimulus package to make sure that we come out of this strong, would you go one way or the other? Any thoughts on that?
I can only give my consumer personal view, which is, if someone offered me that, would that make me go to the restaurant? Answer is probably not. If I'm not feeling confident enough,
you still need that confidence.
You still need that confidence back. I mean, I do think anything we can do to help these businesses right now is what we need to do. So, if I think there needs to be some programs. We just need to make sure it's at the right time for the market and for the consumers that underline it. But again, that's just my personal view. Personally, I also can't wait to get back to restaurants and eat out again.
Right. It's kind of the Goldilocks moment, right? Give out some stimulus when people are ready to be stimulated, I guess, in from a confidence perspective. Like too early is won't be effective and too late will be too late, I guess.
One thing we did do actually locally, and this was just in the local community I live in, we actually came together, and there's a program whereby restaurants, you can basically donate money. The restaurants will pull together a package and give food to people who need it. So that was one way that we were trying to help support. So there's little things like that in the community that I think are really helping. But again, I think there is a bigger program that needs to potentially be put in place. But what that is, I'm unfortunately not the expert on that.
Yeah. Last economic question, pulling back to what you are expert on, economic analysis. Are you worried about inflationary pressures on both? We've kind of talked around about it, but I'm seeing more. I'm talking to a lot of retailers this week who are seeing inflationary pressures on things, everything from pallets to containers, and it's going to find its way into prices on certain commodities. We've already seen it on, lumber, for example, which is just bananas expensive. Do you think that can be a bit of a governor on the recovery, or are you thinking about that today? And I know it's a complex model to even think about, but give me your thoughts on that.
It is. I mean, it obviously is a concern. I know there's some reports coming out in which the inflationary rise we've seen might be temporary. Some people think it might go a bit longer. I mean, for me, the bit I'm concerned about, if I was to point at something, would be interest rates. We've seen a lot of consumers, household debt's down, but you've got people taking on very large mortgages, which is great. But at the same time, there has to be that balance between, if interest rates change over the next year or two, have people put themselves in a position they can still afford to make those repayments.
Right.
One thing we've seen the last quarter is things like HELOCs, so home equity lines of credit. They're on the increase in terms of new HELOCs. The balances are the highest we've seen. So, where you kind of have some elements in the credit and the finance world where it's variable rates, payment commitments, that's just something to be really mindful of, particularly for consumers, but also businesses. If interest rates go up, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Are you still able to make those repayments? And that's the one where, we saw in 2019, people got caught out on that when interest rates increased. So.
Right. Well, listen, lots of great information, this study, and I'm sure you've got lots more. Where can listeners go to find out more about the work you do and stuff you publish and learn more about the work that Equifax is doing to try and help us all figure this out?
Yeah, so we do have a wealth of information on our website, equifax.ca. We also have regular webinars, blogs, press releases, so just keep an eye out for those, and there's always some good information in there.
All right. Well, Becky, thanks for joining me on the Voice of Retail podcast and a belated welcome to Canada. Hope you continue to enjoy it. You're not enjoying the full experience for the past year, but this too shall pass. So listen, once again, thanks for doing all this work and joining me on the podcast today, and I wish you much continued success.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of The Voice of Retail. Be sure and follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy podcasts, so you don't miss out on the latest episodes, industry news, and insights. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a rating review, as it really helps us grow so that we continue to get amazing guests onto the show. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of LeBlanc Company Inc., and if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at meleblanc.co. Until next time, stay safe, have a great week.